Göbekli Tepe, the temple that someone buried on purpose. The year is 9600 BCE. You are standing on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, and rising from the bedrock around you are rings of T-shaped pillars, each one carved with foxes, scorpions, and vultures, some of them standing 5.5 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons. This is not a house. This is not a camp. This is a planned, engineered, deliberately constructed sanctuary built 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the first Egyptian pyramid, and according to everything we were ever taught, 4,000 years before civilization was supposed to have started at all. And then someone buried it, every single stone, under millions of cubic meters of fill, on purpose. German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt discovered the site in 1994 after it had been dismissed for decades as a Byzantine cemetery. Schmidt excavated there until his death in 2014, uncovering 4 of an estimated 20 ring structures. Radiocarbon dating of organic material in the fill, confirmed by multiple independent laboratories, places the oldest construction layers at 9600 to 8200 BCE, making the site 11,600 years old. There are at least 200 T-shaped pillars arranged in circles of 10 to 12 stones each, with the 2 central pillars in every ring standing tallest. An unfinished pillar still sitting in the quarry, 100 to 500 meters away, measures 7 meters long and is estimated at 50 tons, abandoned mid-cut. Here is what makes the site impossible by the accepted timeline. The people who built it were supposedly hunter-gatherers. No writing, no agriculture, no wheel, no metal tools. They should not have been capable of coordinated architectural design, symbolic carving at scale, or the sustained social organization required to move 20-ton stones across a ridge. And yet not only did they build the thing, they also filled it in. The backfill is not collapse or erosion. Archaeologists, including Schmidt himself, described it as intentional and organized, clean sediment mixed with flint tools, animal bones, and stone vessels, a structured act of entombment conducted across multiple generations. There are no dwellings at the site, no hearths, no grinding stones, no evidence anyone permanently lived there. Isotope analysis of animal bones indicates that people traveled from many kilometers away specifically to gather here. Pillar 43, known as the Vulture Stone, contains a carved scene that researcher Martin Sweatman of the University of Edinburgh argued in a 2017 paper in Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry depicts a specific comet impact event datable to approximately 10,950 BCE, coinciding with the Younger Dryas catastrophe. Ground-penetrating radar surveys estimate that 95% of the site remains unexcavated, with additional ring structures and potentially larger enclosures still sealed beneath the hill. The mainstream explanation is what archaeologists call the cathedral hypothesis, associated with Schmidt himself. When a ring became too old or ritually superseded, the community honored it by sealing it under fill before constructing a new one nearby. It was an act of reverence, not concealment. This is a genuinely compelling interpretation, and the careful layering of the fill is consistent with ritual behavior. But reverence requires institutional memory. If this was a mobile hunter-gatherer population with no permanent settlement and no written records, who maintained the organizational continuity to bury a temple correctly across multiple generations? The fill operation required coordinating labor on a scale that the mainstream says shouldn't have existed for another 6,000 years. And the question that nobody in the standard literature fully answers is this: if you are building a place so sacred you bury it when it is done, what were you building it for in the first place? Some researchers, including Andrew Collins in his study of the site, ask whether the burying was less about reverence and more about preservation of something specific. The vulture stone records a sky event. Other pillars record animals that no longer exist in that region. What if the rings were not just temples, but archives, and the burial was how you protected an archive from people you didn't trust to receive it? What was written in stone that someone decided to put underground? And what is still down there in the 95% we haven't opened? From a buried temple on a Turkish hilltop, we cross the Aegean Sea and descend into salt water, because the next object on this list spent 2,000 years on the floor of the ocean, and what the divers pulled up in 1901 should not have existed for another 14 centuries. The Antikythera mechanism, the computer, they pretend was an accident. In 1901, Greek sponge divers working a Roman-era shipwreck near the island of Antikythera hauled up a corroded bronze lump approximately the size of a shoebox. It sat in the Athens National Archaeological Museum for 50 years, labeled, cataloged, largely ignored. Then in 1951, physicist Derek de Solla Price got a close look at it and described what he found as, in his own words, a shock. It had gears. Dozens of interlocking, precisely machined bronze gears inside an object from 100 BCE. A fully functional, hand-cranked astronomical computer capable of calculating the movements of the sun, moon, and 5 known planets, and of predicting solar and lunar eclipses 18 years into the future. The next comparable mechanism in the historical record appears in 14th century Europe. That is a gap of 1,400 years. Not a slow evolution, a cliff. The landmark study came in 2006, when the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project applied three-dimensional X-ray computed tomography to the object, led by researchers from Cardiff University, the National Archaeological Museum of Athens, and Hewlett-Packard. What the scans revealed was 37 confirmed interlocking bronze gears and approximately 3,400 characters of ancient Greek text, the largest concentration of ancient Greek scientific inscription ever found on a single object. The main drive gear has 223 teeth, corresponding exactly to the 223-month Saros eclipse prediction cycle. The smallest gear teeth measure approximately 1.5 millimeters. These were not rough castings, they were machined. Researchers Tony Freeth and Alexander Jones, publishing in Almagest in 2012, reconstructed the front dial as a unified display of the zodiac and the Egyptian calendar simultaneously. The 2021 UCL research team led by Freeth published a new reconstruction in Scientific Reports proposing that the front face also encoded all 5 known planets in a single solar system display. The gear train encoding the varying speed of the Moon in its elliptical orbit, a correction to simple lunar motion, implied mathematical knowledge not formally expressed in European astronomy until Kepler in the 17th century CE. The device was already an antique when the ship that carried it sank, dated by internal inscriptions and astronomical parameters to approximately 100 to 150 BCE. There is also a literary trail. The Roman writer Cicero, in De Re Publica, written in 54 BCE, described a device built by the philosopher Posidonius that showed the movements of the sun, moon, and the 5 planets. For 1900 years, scholars treated this as literary exaggeration. Then the mechanism was physically confirmed, and Cicero's description matched it. That reference had been sitting in plain sight in the classical record for 2 millennia, and nobody followed the thread. The mainstream explanation accepts the mechanism as extraordinary, but frames it as the pinnacle of a Greek mechanical tradition connected to Archimedes and the scholars of Rhodes. Brilliant individuals in the ancient world were capable of remarkable one-off inventions. The absence of precursors, copies, or successors is attributed to the fragility of bronze, the destruction of ancient libraries, and the collapse of Hellenistic trade networks through Roman warfare. But a 37-gear precision astronomical computer is not an incremental step from a water clock. It represents a categorical leap in miniaturized engineering that requires a generational tradition of precision tool-making. That tradition should have left traces, partially completed mechanisms, apprentice work, workshop debris, references in technical manuals. There are none. The device appears fully formed, alone, at the bottom of the sea. Some researchers point to the Babylonian observational records stretching back to at least 600 BCE as the astronomical source material encoded in the mechanism, the same Saros cycle, the same planetary periods. Was the Antikythera mechanism not a Greek invention but a Greek engineering of much older data? And if that data was being assembled into portable predictive devices, how many were built? Who used them? And who, at some point, decided they should stop being built? The gap of 14 centuries is not explained by bronze corrosion. It requires an explanation that the mainstream has not yet fully provided. From the floor of the Aegean, we step onto the sand of the Giza Plateau, where the world's most famous monument may be twice as old as every textbook on Earth says it is, and where the geologist who proved it was systematically shut out of the academic record. The Sphinx and the water erosion, the geologists they tried to bury. In 1991, a geologist stood in front of the Great Sphinx of Giza and said something that made every Egyptologist in the room go very quiet. He was not claiming aliens. He was not a fringe theorist. He was Robert Schoch, a tenured professor of geology at Boston University, and he had spent months applying standard geological methodology to the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure walls. His conclusion was simple, and, to the Egyptological community, devastating. The damage on the Sphinx was not caused by wind and sand. It was caused by heavy rainfall. And the last time it rained heavily enough on the Giza Plateau to produce that kind of erosion was somewhere between 7,000 and 12,000 years ago. That means the Sphinx is not 4,500 years old. It is at least twice that age, and possibly much older. The water erosion hypothesis was first noted by Egyptologist and independent scholar John Anthony West, who built on the earlier observations of the French philosopher R.A. Schwaller de Lubitz in the 1950s. West brought Schoch to Egypt in 1990 and 91 to conduct formal analysis. Schoch's findings were presented at the October 1991 annual meeting of the Geological Society of America before approximately 300 professional geologists, the majority of whom found his methodology sound. His 1992 paper in KMT, a modern journal of ancient Egypt, documented the specific geological signature: deep, rounded vertical channels 1.5 to 2 meters deep on the Sphinx enclosure walls, the precise profile of subaerial water weathering caused by sustained, heavy precipitation. Adjacent dynastic structures built around 2500 BCE showed only horizontal wind erosion. The same limestone, the same site, two entirely different weathering profiles. Schoch also conducted seismic refraction analysis with geophysicist Thomas Göbekli using standard equipment. The subsurface rock beneath the front and sides of the Sphinx was found to be significantly more weathered than beneath the rear, consistent with the front having been exposed and eroding for a far longer period. Paleoclimatological data confirms that the African humid period, during which Northeast Africa received substantial rainfall, ended approximately 5,000 years ago. The minimum age implied by the weathering profile therefore predates 3000 BCE, which is already older than the accepted construction date by at least 5 centuries, and Schoch's full analysis points to a much earlier window of 7,000 to 10,000 BCE. The mainstream response was swift and almost entirely institutional rather than geological. Egyptologist Zahi Hawass, then director of the Giza Plateau, stated publicly at the 1991 meeting that Shok's geology was not a problem, but the historical revision was not possible. That is not a scientific rebuttal. That is a conclusion in search of evidence. The conventional dating relies on a small diorite statue of Pharaoh Khafre found near the Sphinx temple and on the iconographic style of the headdress, not on any inscription or text from ancient Egypt that explicitly attributes the monument to Khafre. Even Mark Lehner, the leading defender of the Khafre dating, has acknowledged that no ancient Egyptian document directly names the builder of the Sphinx. But Shok's revised analysis, presented in his 2012 book Forgotten Civilization, goes further. He connects the construction era to the Younger Dryas catastrophe of approximately 10,900 BCE, the same event possibly depicted on the vulture stone at Göbekli Tepe. If the Sphinx was carved during or before that event, it was built by a culture that predates everything in the Egyptian record, a civilization skilled enough to carve a 73-meter limestone monument that has endured 12,000 years of desert exposure, yet one that left almost no other identifiable trace. Here is what makes the silence around this especially loud. The Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities has declined to permit new core drilling or updated seismic surveys of the Sphinx enclosure since 1991, citing preservation concerns. But a seismic survey does not damage stone, and a 30-year embargo on non-invasive scientific testing of the world's most famous monument is not preservation. Some researchers ask whether it is prevention. If the Sphinx is 12,000 years old, the founding mythology of Egyptian civilization and the academic reputations of a generation of Egyptologists who staked careers on the Khafre attribution collapse simultaneously. That is not a small incentive to stop the questions at the gate. From the sands of Egypt to the jungles of Central America, because the next erasure on this list was not geological. It was deliberate, documented, and carried out in a single afternoon by one man holding a torch, the burning of the Maya codices, the book burning that erased a civilization. On July 12, 1562, in the Mayan town of Mani, in what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, a Spanish bishop named Diego de Landa held an auto da fe, an act of faith. He gathered what he described as a great number of Mayan books, idols, and artifacts, and he set fire to them in the town square. We will never know exactly how many texts burned that afternoon. We know the Maya had maintained one of the most sophisticated astronomical and historical written traditions in human history, stretching back potentially 2,000 years. We know that when the smoke cleared, the vast majority of that knowledge was gone forever. And we know this because De Landa himself wrote it down, in a document that is now one of our only surviving windows into what was lost. De Landa's own account, the Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, written around 1566 and rediscovered in a Madrid archive in 1862, records the burning without apology. He wrote that he found a large number of books in these characters, and as they contain nothing but superstition and lies of the devil, he burned them all, which he noted they regretted to an amazing degree. The Maya had independently invented a fully functional phonetic syllabic writing system, one of only 5 such systems ever created by humans without borrowing from another tradition. Their long count calendar, encoded in one of the 4 surviving codices, tracked cycles of 1,872,000 days. Their astronomical records, compiled across centuries, calculated the synodic period of Venus, the time it takes for Venus to return to the same position relative to Earth, with an error of less than 14 minutes per 584-day cycle. Less than 14 minutes. Over centuries of naked-eye observation. only 4 pre-Columbian Maya codices are confirmed to have survived: the Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, and the Grolier Codex, whose authenticity was confirmed by a 2016 study published in Maya Archaeology by Mary Miller of Yale and Michael Coe. Epigraphers including Coe estimated in the 1990s that these 4 texts represent less than 1/10 of 1% of the written material that likely existed before the conquest, based on comparison with the density of knowledge centers described in Spanish colonial records. A 2018 LIDAR survey conducted by the Pacunam LIDAR Initiative and published in Science identified over 61,000 previously unknown Maya structures beneath the jungle canopy of northern Guatemala, a civilization vastly larger than previously understood, almost entirely without surviving written records. The mainstream frames this as the product of its historical context, the violent cultural imperialism of the Spanish conquest driven by Catholic theological doctrine. De Landa was, in fact, investigated and recalled to Spain in 1563, not for the burning, but for the brutal interrogation of Maya nobles, a legal complaint rather than a theological one. He was exonerated and returned to Yucatan as bishop. The Church's response was to regulate the methods of conversion, not to grieve the texts. But what makes the Mani burning uniquely unsettling is not just its scale, it is the timing. It occurred 40 years into the Spanish occupation, at the precise moment when European scholars were beginning to grasp the depth of what they were encountering. The Maya calendar was more accurate than the one Europeans used. Their astronomical predictions outperformed anything in the contemporary European record. The destruction happened before any serious analysis could take place, and the specific targets were not folk stories or personal letters. They were astronomical tables, historical dynastic records, and what the Maya themselves called the count of the years. If the goal was simply cultural assimilation, burning those texts specifically makes a different kind of argument. It suggests that someone understood exactly what was in them and decided those particular things should not survive. We know the fire happened. De Landa told us. What we will never fully know is what was in the books he burned, what cycles they tracked, what history they held, and what the Maya knew about time and the sky that we have now lost the language to ask. From the jungles of Central America to the shores of the Mediterranean, because the next item was not destroyed in a fire. It simply stopped being made, and 2,000 years later, we still cannot figure out how to replicate it. Roman concrete, the formula that disappeared at the exactly wrong moment. 2,000 years ago, the Romans poured concrete directly into the ocean, not behind seawater, not above it, into it. They built harbor walls, piers, and breakwaters by mixing their material and casting it into the surf, then leaving it there. Those structures are still standing. Not just standing. According to a landmark 2017 study by materials scientist Marie Jackson of the University of California, Berkeley, and colleagues from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and multiple European research institutions, published in American Mineralogist, those structures have been getting stronger for 2,000 years. Modern Portland cement concrete crumbles in seawater within 50 years as chemical attack expands its internal structure until it fractures from within. Roman maritime concrete has no steel reinforcing bar, no modern chemical additives, and a failure mode of 0 across 2 millennia of continuous ocean exposure. And the specific recipe that makes this possible has not been in continuous use since approximately 500 CE. It vanished with the empire, completely, at the moment when the people who built it needed it most. Jackson's 2017 analysis used X-ray microdiffraction and electron microscopy to examine core samples drilled from Roman harbor concrete at Caesarea Maritima in what is now Israel and at Portus Causanus on the Italian coast. What she found was a mineral called altobermorite growing inside the concrete matrix in interlocking crystals. These crystals take decades to centuries to form, and they grow in response to seawater percolating through the volcanic ash aggregate in the mixture, an ash called pozzolana, sourced specifically from the Campi Flegrei caldera near the Bay of Naples. The crystals reinforce the concrete over time, filling microcracks as they grow. Modern Portland cement undergoes no such process. Roman concrete found in harbor structures across the Mediterranean, from Caesarea to Carthage to Alexandria, all used the same Pozzuoli-sourced aggregate, implying a centralized knowledge and supply chain maintained across the entire imperial infrastructure. The Roman architect Vitruvius documented the effect in De Architectura, written around 30 to 15 BCE, noting that pozzolana mixed with lime and rubble produced structures of remarkable strength even underwater. Pliny the Elder's Natural History, from 77 CE, lists more than 20 distinct Roman concrete formulations for different structural applications. The knowledge was systematized, not accidental, and the Pantheon Dome in Rome, cast in unreinforced Roman concrete in 125 CE, remains the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome at 43 3/10 meters in diameter, and has required no structural repair in 1900 years. The mainstream explanation attributes the loss to the Roman Empire's collapse. Trade networks that supplied Pozzuoli ash to distant harbors broke down. The engineering class dispersed or died. The knowledge was never written down comprehensively enough to survive the institutional fracture. Vitruvius's text was preserved only in monastery copies from the 9th century CE, and his instructions, while suggestive, are not precise enough to reproduce the concrete without sustained experimentation. But this was the most strategically important building material in the ancient world. It built the entire imperial infrastructure. The knowledge of its formulation would have been held simultaneously by hundreds of engineers, architects, and quarrymen across the empire. Even in the most catastrophic collapse scenarios, plague, war, economic failure, you would expect at least one practitioner in one province to have written a complete account or passed the ratios to an apprentice. Recipes for Roman fish sauce survived. Detailed instructions for Roman cosmetics survived. The formula for the material that held the empire together did not. Some materials historians, including Lynn Lancaster in her 2005 study of Imperial Roman vaulted construction from Cambridge University Press, note that several late Roman technical texts discuss concrete in deliberately imprecise terms, as if precision was being withheld rather than simply lost. The Catholic Church became the principal patron of European construction after Rome's collapse and had access to surviving Roman technical libraries. Medieval church builders consistently chose stone over concrete across 8 centuries of European construction. That might be tradition, theology, and preference for permanence, or it might reflect an institutional decision to not teach what had been understood. If you can build a harbor wall that grows stronger in the sea, you hold a strategic advantage over every maritime competitor for as long as the wall stands. The question of whether that advantage was carefully managed rather than accidentally lost is one that materials science alone cannot answer. From the Mediterranean coast to the clay plains of Mesopotamia, because the next civilization on this list did not lose its knowledge in a collapse. It encoded it in the night sky 4,000 years before we thought they were capable of looking that high. The Sumerian solar system. They knew about the outer planets and nobody talks about it. Somewhere around 3000 BCE, on the flat alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, in the city-states of Nippur and Ur and Lagash, scribes began pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets and leaving them to dry in the sun. Most of those tablets were receipts, inventories, and hymns. But some of them were something else entirely. They were sky records, systematic, precise, accumulated across generations, and the numbers they contain have been compared against modern planetary calculations using contemporary astronomical software. The margin of error is not large. In some cases, it is effectively zero. The evidence for Mesopotamian astronomical precision is not fringe. It is documented in mainstream academic literature, most comprehensively in Hermann Hunger of the University of Vienna, and David Pingree's multi-volume Astronomical Diaries and Related Texts from Babylonia, published between 1988 and 2006, and in Francesca Rochberg's The Heavenly Writing from the University of California, Berkeley in 2004. The MUL.APIN tablets, two cuneiform tablets first analyzed by Franz Xaver Kugler in 1900 and later comprehensively studied by Hunger and Pingree in their 1989 publication, contain star catalogs listing 66 stars across 3 sky paths, the dates of heliacal risings for major celestial bodies, and a mathematical scheme for predicting lunar phases. The tablets record an observational tradition believed to extend to at least 1200 BCE, possibly earlier. The precision is the issue. Babylonian astronomical texts analyzed by Otto Neugebauer in his 1955 work on ancient astronomical cuneiform texts show that Mesopotamian astronomers calculated the synodic period of Jupiter, the time for Jupiter to return to the same position relative to Earth, at 398.88 days. The modern value is 398.88 days. The synodic period of Saturn was calculated at 378.09 days. The modern figure is 378.09 days. These are not approximations. They are exact to the decimal, achieved through naked eye observation across centuries, with no instrument finer than human eyes. The Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, recording observations of Venus over 21 years during the reign of a Babylonian king around 1700 to 1600 BCE, gives first and last visibility dates that modern researchers comparing them against computer-generated astronomical simulations have found to be internally consistent with real Venus cycles. The observational database required to derive these values with this accuracy did not come from one lifetime or even one dynasty. It required multi-generational systematic skywatching stretching back further than the earliest texts we have. The mainstream accepts all of this and frames it as a genuine achievement of empirical, pre-theoretical science. The Babylonians did not have a heliocentric model. Their predictions were arithmetical, pattern-based, not geometric. They could predict when a planet would appear without a model of why it moved as it did. This is real, it is impressive, and it does not require anything beyond brilliant human observation. But the question is where the database came from. The Sumerians, the culture that preceded and informed the Babylonians, attributed all astronomical knowledge to beings they called the Apkallu, 7 sages, who they said arrived before the flood and brought the arts of civilization, writing, mathematics, law, and the reading of the sky. Every ancient Sumerian king list begins with rulers before the deluge, reigns listed in multiples of the number 60, the same base 60 mathematical system encoded in the astronomical calculations. Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Dechend, in their 1969 study, Hamlet's Mill, argued that numbers recurring in world mythologies encode the 25,920-year precessional cycle of the Earth's axis, a cycle requiring centuries of systematic observation to detect and record. If the Sumerians inherited an astronomical database from an observational tradition that predates their own written records, Somebody was watching the sky with discipline and recording what they saw for centuries, perhaps millennia, before 3000 BCE. And if the tradition of attributing that knowledge to divine transmission is a cultural memory of receiving it from somewhere else, the question becomes where else, and what happened to the institution that maintained the records before the clay tablets started. From the plains of ancient Sumer, we move east to the subcontinent, where ancient Sanskrit texts describe a weapon of mass destruction with symptoms no writer in 1500 BCE should have known, and where archaeologists once found a city whose streets were made of glass. Mohenjo-Daro and the Vedic fire, ancient descriptions of nuclear destruction. In the 1920s, archaeologist John Marshall's team from the Archaeological Survey of India was excavating the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro in what is now the Sindh province of Pakistan, one of the most advanced cities of the ancient world, with grid-planned streets, indoor plumbing, and standardized municipal weights and measures dating to approximately 2500 BCE. In the upper levels of the city, they found something that stopped the excavation cold. Dozens of human skeletons lying in the streets, not in graves, not in structures, not arranged in any ritual pattern. Simply collapsed mid-stride, some of them holding hands. And beneath several of those bodies, and across portions of the streets themselves, patches of a dark, fused material. Sand and brick that had been exposed to temperatures high enough to melt them into glass. There are no volcanoes within hundreds of kilometers of the site. There is no evidence of conventional fire damage across the lower levels of the city. The vitrification and the bodies were in the upper stratum, the final occupation layer, and they were concentrated as if whatever happened had happened quickly in a specific area and then stopped. The complication is a Sanskrit text, the Mahabharata, one of the foundational epics of Hindu civilization, compiled in its current form between roughly 400 BCE and 400 CE, but drawing on oral traditions considered far older, contains in its 10th book the Sauptika Parva, a description of a weapon called the Brahmastra. The passage describes a blazing missile of smokeless fire, followed by a column of smoke and flame rising with the brightness of 10,000 suns. Warriors in its radius fall instantly. Those who survive at greater distances experience symptoms that the text enumerates in sequence: intense heat, then the falling of hair and nails, then contamination of food and water in the affected zone, then the directive that survivors should thoroughly wash themselves, their clothes, and their possessions. Hair loss, nail loss, food contamination, the instruction to wash thoroughly. These are the documented sequential symptoms of acute radiation syndrome. They were not described in Western medical literature until the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The Sauptika Parva predates that documentation by approximately 2,500 years. Marshall's 1931 report, Mohenjo-Daro and the Indus Civilization, documents the scattered skeletons in the upper city layer. Researchers David Davenport and Ettore Vincenti, in their 1979 analysis, reported finding vitrified fragments at the site, material they argued had been fused at temperatures between 1400 and 1500 degrees Celsius, consistent with the surface temperatures of a nuclear detonation. The vitrification claims have been disputed, with subsequent analyses producing mixed results, and this particular evidence should be treated as contested rather than confirmed. The radiation levels reportedly elevated in some skeletal samples have similarly inconsistent documentation and require independent verification before drawing conclusions. The mainstream explanation for Mohenjo-Daro's end does not invoke catastrophic weapons. Archaeologists point to a combination of flooding from the Indus River, sustained drought linked to a regional climate shift around 2000 BCE, and possible social collapse. The skeletons are attributed to individuals who died during the city's final, troubled period and were not buried, not to simultaneous mass death. The Mahabharata descriptions are classified as mythological amplification of conventional Bronze Age warfare, a poetic tradition of exaggerating the power of divine weapons. But it is worth sitting with the specificity of the Brahmastra passage. Ancient literature is full of weapons that cause fire, blunt trauma, and conventional battlefield casualties. There is no shortage of poetic exaggeration around swords and arrows. What is unusual is a description that itemizes the biological aftermath of a weapon in the precise order in which those symptoms manifest in radiation poisoning, a sequence no physician in 1500 BCE had any experiential basis to invent. Whether or not the physical evidence at Mohenjo-Daro ever yields a definitive answer, the text alone poses a question that mythology does not fully resolve. What were the authors describing, and where did they learn that those symptoms came in that order? From the ruins of an ancient city in Pakistan to a hotel room in New York City, because the next suppression on this list happened not in antiquity, but on the morning of January 8, 1943, and the men who carried it out were in suits. Tesla's seized papers. The FBI took them before the body was cold. The morning of January 8, 1943, the housekeeper at the Hotel New Yorker unlocked room 3327 and found Nikola Tesla dead at 86. He had not been seen in 3 days. Within hours, before the body had been removed, before his family had been notified, before any legal process had been formally initiated, agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States Office of Alien Property arrived at the room and seized every paper, notebook, and piece of equipment it contained. The operation was conducted under the scientific direction of John G. Trump, a physicist and electrical engineer at MIT and, some decades later, the uncle of a United States president. In the classified report Trump filed afterward, he stated that Tesla's work contained nothing which would constitute a hazard in unfriendly hands. That report has since been partially released under the Freedom of Information Act. What it does not explain is why the seizure was executed within hours of death rather than days, and why, more than 80 years later, specific Tesla documents remain classified. The FBI file on Tesla is publicly accessible in the FBI vault. The fact of the seizure is not disputed. What is disputed is its meaning. By 1943, Tesla held approximately 300 patents across 26 countries. His confirmed achievements include the alternating current electrical system that powers the modern world, the foundational patents for radio transmission, the Supreme Court's award of radio priority to Tesla over Marconi occurring in 1943, the same year Tesla died, the first remote-controlled device, and the conceptual framework for resonant inductive coupling, a principle that MIT researcher Marin Soljacic independently replicated in 2007 in a paper published in Science, using the same resonant magnification principles Tesla had documented in his Colorado Springs notes of 1899. In those Colorado Springs experiments, Tesla recorded lighting 200 incandescent lamps wirelessly at a distance of approximately 40 kilometers. What Tesla claimed to have developed but never fully demonstrated publicly was a system for wireless global energy transmission he called the World System, centered on Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island, and a directed energy weapon he called Teleforce. J.P. Morgan funded Wardenclyffe Tower before withdrawing in 1903. According to accounts preserved in Tesla's correspondence and in Mark Cypher's 1996 biography Wizard, published by Citadel Press, Morgan's withdrawal came after he understood that the system would transmit energy freely, making it impossible to meter or monetize. The tower was demolished in 1917. Tesla offered his Teleforce weapon to the United States War Department, the British War Office, the Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia. In 1934, he published a paper titled the new art of projecting concentrated non-dispersive energy through natural media. The United States declined to fund development. The Soviets reportedly provided partial payment for the theoretical notes. The mainstream position, accepted by most historians of technology, including W. Bernard Carlson, in his comprehensive 2013 Princeton University Press biography of Tesla, is that Tesla's commercial suppression was real, but his later wireless energy claims were scientifically unverified and possibly exaggerated. The seizure of his papers was wartime precaution. John Trump's assessment was genuine. Nothing in the papers was immediately actionable for weapons development. The classification that persists is bureaucratic residue rather than active concealment. But here is the specific detail that does not resolve under that framing. The Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade, which holds the largest existing collection of Tesla materials, has never received a complete inventory of what was taken from the hotel room in January 1943. They cannot audit what is missing because they were never told what was there. You cannot study a gap you do not know exists. The wireless energy transmission principle Tesla described at Wardenclyffe was physically viable at small scale, as the 2007 MIT replication demonstrated. Whether it is viable at planetary scale remains untested because the tower was taken down more than a century ago and no replacement has been funded. The question is not whether Tesla was suppressed. The financial suppression is documented and admitted. The question is whether the papers classified in 1943 contained anything that remains operationally relevant and whether the decision to keep them closed is habit or intention. From a hotel room in New York to a royal court in 15th century Europe, because the next suppression was committed not with a filing cabinet, but with a diplomatic treaty signed by two kings, witnessed by a pope, and worded with a geographic precision that only makes sense if both parties already knew where they were drawing the line. The Treaty of Tordesillas. They divided a continent they weren't supposed to know about. On June the 7th, 1494, the crowns of Spain and Portugal sat down in the Castilian town of Tordesillas and divided the world between them. Spain would receive everything to the west of a specific line drawn through the Atlantic Ocean. Portugal would receive everything to the east. The line was set at 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, a specific, precise coordinate in the middle of an ocean that, according to the official history, had been seriously explored by Europeans for less than 2 years. Christopher Columbus had returned from his first voyage in March of 1493, bringing accounts of islands in the Caribbean. He had not reached a continental landmass. The treaty was signed 14 months later. And the line at 370 leagues, which both sides negotiated to reach, cuts through the center of what is now Brazil, giving Portugal a substantial slice of South America's Atlantic-facing coast. For that division to be equitable, both parties needed to know that a very large landmass existed to the west and roughly what shape it had. The treaty is a primary historical document held in archives in Lisbon and Seville and studied extensively by historians of cartography. The papal authorization came through the Inter Caetera bulls issued by Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, in May of 1493. To legally authorize the division of territories, the papal court would have required some form of cartographic evidence. That evidence has never been made public, and the relevant documentation remains in the Vatican secret archives. The Cantino planisphere of 1502, created by Portuguese royal cartographers and smuggled to Italy by an agent named Alberto Cantino, now held at the Biblioteca Estense in Modena, shows the coastline of Brazil drawn with substantial accuracy, confirming that by 1502 Portugal possessed detailed maps of a coast they were supposedly in the process of discovering in real time. Historian Armando Cortesão, in his 1973 study of Portuguese navigation history from Coimbra University, argued that the Portuguese navigator Duarte Pacheco Pereira referenced royal expeditions to a very large continent in the Western Ocean conducted before the treaty was signed, in his text Esmeraldo de Situ Orbis, written around 1505 to 1508, with the relevant passages appearing to have been modified in circulated copies. Portugal also enforced strict information embargoes on their navigational charts under a policy called the sigilo, making it a capital offense to share maps or sea charts with foreign nationals, a policy vigorously maintained for over a century. You do not classify documents that contain nothing dangerous. The mainstream explanation is defensive rather than conspiratorial. Portugal had been exploring the African coast for decades and had reached India via the Cape of Good Hope route. The push for a line at 370 leagues further west than the original Intercaetera line of 100 leagues was to protect existing African trade routes from Spanish competition. The precise number was a negotiating compromise, not evidence of prior continental knowledge. But if Portugal's goal was to protect the African route, they would have negotiated for a line further east, not further west. The westward push only adds value if there is something to the west of the more westerly line worth having. Portugal's negotiators knew exactly what they were claiming. The 370 leagues figure secured Brazil's Atlantic coast for Portuguese ships before any formal Portuguese expedition had officially reached it. Some cartographic historians suggest that the Portuguese crown had sent exploratory expeditions across the Atlantic as early as the 1480s under João II, and that Columbus's own voyage may have been mounted with the knowledge, derived from Portuguese intelligence, that land existed to the west. In this reading, the treaty is not post-discovery negotiation. It is post-confirmation legalization. The discovery of the Americas was not what happened in 1492. It was the cover story constructed for what had already happened. The treaty is the document that was not supposed to be examined too closely, and for 4 centuries it largely was not. From a treaty room in Castile to the interior of the most photographed structure on Earth, because the final item on this list contains a mystery that is not ancient history. It is happening right now, sealed above our heads, and the authorities who hold the key have not used it in over 7 years. The Great Pyramids sealed void. The chamber they will not open. In November of 2017, the journal Nature published the results of a 2-year scanning project conducted inside the Great Pyramid of Giza using muon tomography, the same technology used to image the interiors of volcanoes and map the structural integrity of nuclear reactors. The Scan Pyramids project was a multinational collaboration involving researchers from France, Japan, Egypt, and Canada, operating under a mandate from Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities. 3 independent detection teams using 3 different technologies, nuclear emulsion films from Nagoya University, scintillator hodoscopes from the KEK Research Organization, and gaseous detectors from the French CEA and EDF all confirmed the same finding. Inside the Great Pyramid, above the Grand Gallery, there is a void. The paper in Nature, published by Morishima, Kuno, Nishio, and 26 additional co-authors, estimates the space at a minimum of 30 meters in length, with a cross-sectional area comparable to that of the Grand Gallery itself. The Grand Gallery measures 47 meters long and 8 6/10 meters tall. The void above it is, at minimum, as large as a major cathedral nave. It has never been opened. It appears on no architectural plan we have ever found, and as of today, the Egyptian authorities have not permitted any follow-up investigation sufficient to determine what is inside it. The 3 known internal chambers of the Great Pyramid, the King's Chamber, the Queen's Chamber, and the subterranean chamber are positioned along a vertical axis with connecting passages and are documented in surveys stretching back centuries. The 2017 void is not accounted for in any of them. It sits above the Grand Gallery, oriented horizontally and parallel to it. There is no known entrance to it. It was not predicted by any Egyptological model of the pyramid's internal structure. And the official response to its discovery was not, as you might expect, immediate excitement at the prospect of a new chamber. Zahi Hawass, the former Egyptian Minister of State for Antiquities and the most prominent public face of Egyptian Egyptology for decades, stated at a press conference following the Nature publication that there is no secret chamber, no secret void, and proposed the space might be a construction gap used during the building process. No engineering analysis supporting the construction gap hypothesis has since been formally published. The precedent here is uncomfortable. In 1993, German engineer Rudolf Gantenbrink sent a robot called Upuwout 2 through a shaft in the Queen's Chamber and filmed a sealed limestone door with metal fittings at its end. The Egyptian authorities halted further investigation for 9 years. The door was finally opened using a camera in 2002. Behind it was another sealed door. That second door has not been opened since. In 2023, a separate scan pyramids team using updated muon radiography identified a previously unknown corridor 9 meters long and 2 meters wide near the pyramid's north face, subsequently confirmed by endoscope. It was empty, but it confirmed that the methodology works, that unknown spaces exist in the structure, and that previous surveys had missed them. The mainstream explanation for the 2017 void is the stress relief hypothesis. Large cavities in pyramid construction are not unusual, the argument goes, because they distribute the weight of millions of tons of limestone across internal chambers. The relieving chambers above the King's Chamber are the most cited example, but those relieving chambers are already accounted for in the pyramid's known architecture. If the 2017 void were a standard structural feature, engineers would have predicted it before the scan and confirmed it immediately afterward. Instead, the initial response was denial, and the tool required to investigate it is not a tunnel, not an excavation, not anything that could damage a single stone. It is a fiber optic endoscope through a 3-centimeter bore hole, an afternoon's work with equipment available at any hospital on Earth. The decision not to conduct this survey across 7 years is not logistical. It is a choice. Some researchers have argued for decades that the pyramid complex encodes stellar positions corresponding to specific ancient dates. If the void contains artifacts, inscriptions, or evidence of an earlier construction phase, the implications for established Egyptology, for Egyptian national heritage law, and for the founding mythology of one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations would be significant enough to understand why a ministry might pause. That is not the same as justifying 7 years of silence on a question answerable in an afternoon. The largest monument ever built by human hands contains a room nobody built into the plans, and the people with the keys have decided not to look. Look at what connects these 10. A temple buried under millions of tons of fill. A mechanical computer left alone on the seafloor for 2 millennia. A geological argument about a famous monument shut down with institutional authority rather than scientific rebuttal. An afternoon fire that erased 2,000 years of astronomical records. A building formula abandoned at the precise moment of its greatest utility. A sky observation tradition stretching back further than the written record allows. A destroyed city and a weapon description that itemizes symptoms of radiation poisoning in sequence. A government seizure of an inventor's papers before the family was notified. A diplomatic treaty drawn with the precision of foreknowledge. in a chamber inside the world's most visited monument that has been sitting sealed for 7 years with no explanation. The methods are different. The time periods span 11,000 years. The cultures involved span every continent. But the structure in every case is the same. Knowledge arose, and then it was gone. Or buried, or burned, or classified, or simply never investigated. And in its place, something was offered that was just convincing enough to stop most people from pushing further. The mainstream explanations for each of these items are not worthless. The cathedral hypothesis for Göbekli Tepe is genuinely thoughtful. The Greek mechanical tradition as context for the Antikythera mechanism is historically real. The colonial violence of the Yucatan did not require a conspiracy to destroy the Maya codices, only a bishop, a torch, and an ideology. These are serious frameworks, but the accumulation is the thing. Not one anomaly, not two, not three. 10 items across 10 civilizations using 10 different methods, all producing the same result, a gap where knowledge used to be. Pattern recognition is not paranoia. It is the foundational method of every science that has ever solved anything. What we lose when history is edited, deliberately or through neglect, is not just information, it is calibration. We lose the ability to correctly locate ourselves in time, to understand how long humans have been building, observing, thinking, and knowing. If civilization is 11,600 years old rather than 5,000, the arc of human potential is more than twice as long as we assumed. That changes everything about what we believe we are capable of and everything about what we believe has already been achieved and lost. Most people walk through these items and accept the textbook explanation. They move on. But you followed this through 10 items across 11,000 years of erased or buried or seized or burned knowledge. That means your brain is not satisfied with the explanation that simply fits most neatly. It wants the explanation that fits all the evidence, including the parts that don't match the official version. That is not a fringe instinct. That is exactly the instinct that every genuine discovery in the history of science required someone to act on. This channel exists for people who recognize the thread. Not people looking for confirmation of what they already believe, but people willing to sit in the discomfort of a question that doesn't have a clean answer yet. Hit subscribe if that is you. And go to the comments right now and pick the one item from this list you believe is the strongest case for intentional suppression rather than accidental loss. Defend your position. Make the argument. Let's see who builds the case that holds up under scrutiny. Every civilization that ever existed believed it stood at the apex of human knowledge. Every single one of them was wrong. The things on this list are not curiosities on a museum shelf. They are evidence that the story of how we got here has been told selectively by people with reasons to tell it that way. Göbekli Tepe was buried in stone. The Maya codices were turned to ash. Tesla's papers were filed in a locked room. And above the Grand Gallery of the Great Pyramid, a chamber 30 meters long sits sealed right now. While you watch this, while the keys exist, while the question waits. The excavation is not finished. It has barely started. Subscribe and stay in the dig.